The sky should have been blue over Musutafu. It should have been soft with coastal humidity, smeared with the thin contrails of training drones from UA, buzzing like hopeful insects. It should have smelled of cooking oil from the vendor stalls, and the cheap perfume of teenagers who believed tomorrow would love them back. Instead, that morning, it bled. The clouds split along a jagged seam like skin parted by a scalpel. A roar followed not thunder, but the deep, churning growl of something that disagreed with physics. The sound bounced between skyscrapers already hollowed by anxiety, setting windows humming in migraine pitches. Civilians froze mid-step. They pressed palms to their temples. A few began to reach. No one understood it. Not yet. We felt the air pressure drop, as if the world had taken a breath, but refused to exhale. Birds spiraled downward in broken arcs, their wings too heavy for this new gravity. Strings of red static flickered across traffic screens. The hero billboards, All Might's frozen, eternal grin distorted into vox-strained noise. It tasted metallic. It tasted like blood from a broken nose. It tasted like a lie. When the seam finally tore open, it revealed not heaven, nor warp, nor light, but a corridor of perfect black, paved in silence. A corridor that implied travel. A corridor that implied intent. Something moved inside that void, but the void itself did not speak. It merely waited, patient and absolute, like a judge who already knew the verdict. Cameras caught only fragments, jagged outlines that fought the lens, a cape unfurling in the wind like a sentence, armor gleaming with a tactical, almost surgical restraint, and a silhouette, a tall, predatory silhouette, shoulders squared, jaw carved from cruelty and will. The void spat him out. Impact cratered asphalt, sending a shockwave of glass and dust spiraling into the street. Civilians stumbled, their screams swallowed by static. The air tasted burnt now, copper and ozone, the scent of circuitry dying. For a moment, the figure did not move. Smoke coiled around him like mourning cloth. Then, with the casual certainty of someone who had done this before, he stood, black, armor, no insignia, no colors, just the shape of fear engineered into a suit. The cow's white lenses flickered once, then locked coldly onto the world that had birthed quirks and heroes. Stadiums and rankings, sponsorships and smiling violence. We had no name for him, but his presence named itself, a civilian whispered. At first, trembling, absurd, foreign, Bat, man. The word had no context here. No mythology, no rogues gallery, no Gotham rotting under neon rain and corrupted police precincts, no dead alleyways where justice was an orphan, but the word tasted violent and holy. He moved. Slowly at first, like a tiger sniffing a new cage, cape dragging smoke, boots crushing broken glass. He said nothing, utter silence, save for the faint servo whine in his gauntlets. Microhydraulics tuned for war, not spectacle. 2. Heroes dropped from above, low tier, unimportant to history, except as meat for the prologue. Their costumes were identical in optimism, bright colors, high hopes, and the brittle arrogance of those who believed danger always came with warning labels. "Sir, are you injured?" one asked. Bateman's lenses narrowed into something like irritation. The second hero reached for him, and Batman moved first. A blur of training, older than quirks, older than hero licenses. A counterstrike so economical it bordered on poetry. Disarm, pivot, torque, and the man was choking on asphalt. before his brain understood betrayal. The first hero tried a flash quirk, light, harmless, theatrical. Batman shut it down with a smoke pellet that tasted like burning wires and old nightmares. He did not kill them. That was the first mercy. It would not be the last, but mercy would soon become indistinguishable from cruelty in a world addicted to spectacle. Sirens wailed. Civilians scattered. UA drones spiraled overhead, their sensors straining to classify the new threat. Quirk analysts muttered in lab coats. Government officials demanded answers. And Batman simply observed, calculating, dissecting, interrogating this world with predator silence. Above him, the seam in the sky slowly stitched itself closed, leaving no proof except broken glass, disrupted electromagnetic fields, and two heroes humiliated on live broadcast. Rumors spread instantly, social networks choking with speculation, hashtags blooming like weeds. Alien, villain, secret, UA experiment, new breed of Nomu, mass delusion. But rumors were just static. Batman was Signy. When he finally spoke, it was not to the heroes, nor the drones, nor the operators behind the screens. It was to himself. A low, gravel voice that sounded like it had chewed on trauma for years and found it functional. City with heroes? He muttered, but no justice. Then he vanished into the alleys. Cape swallowed by shadow, footsteps devoured by architecture. If the world had not been afraid yet, it learned quickly. Fear is efficient. Fear is data. Hours later, a tremor rippled through the hero ecosystem. Aizawa narrowed his eyes at surveillance footage. Sukachi drafted reports, thick with unease. Nezu smiled in a way that suggested amusement or war, or both. And in the dorms of UA, students argued in whispers, spines tingling with primitive recognition. Something older than quirks had entered their narrative. Something without rankings, without sponsors, without applause. The city slept poorly. They tried to file him into categories. Humans need categories the way soldiers need orders. Without them, panic breeds. Heroes measured him by training style and assumed foreign agency craft. Police traced his movements against crime syndicate patterns. Analysts compared his physical profile to All Might's before the decay, and to Endeavor's after the burns. None of it was true. None of it was useful. Because Batman did not originate in this world. His myth was not born under banners and parliamentary hero boards. It emerged in a place where a hope wore a badge and then drowned in corruption. Where children learned that being good was a liability and survival demanded clever cruelty. We learned these fragments slowly. Not through exposition but through aftermath. Through patterns. Batman hunted civilians the way a butcher hunts thieves, selectively, without spectacle, but with surgical brutality. Every target was a villain, a trafficker, a corrupt official, or a hero with crimes tucked quietly under their cape. He left them broken, not dead. Bones set at cruel angles, teeth scattered like confetti in alley gutters. Blood smeared over chalk and cigarette butts and still warm ramen cups abandoned in panic. The press called it sadism. The villains called it war. Batman called it consistency. But origins are not measured by your enemies. They are measured by... The stories whispered afterward. We gleaned his world through those whispers, at first shallow, then horrifying. A place called Gotham, a city seemingly birthed from industrial soot and organized crime. A city where the police were not heroic embodiments of moral authority, but cogs in a machine lubricated with bribes, blackmail, and blood. A city whose villains had no need for quirks. Madness was enough. Clowns who murdered without motive. Businessmen who ruled like monarchs. Doctors who carved fear into bodies. Asterisk a city that raised him. A city that broke him. A city that then became his cathedral. His ritual was simple. Find what the world fears most. Become worse. Then turn that horror against the wicked. Our world did not understand rituals. We had training arcs, talent shows, rankings. Gotham had funerals and unmarked graves. There, heroes did not smile for sponsorship deals. There, a cape was not a costume but an obituary waiting its turn. The early history of Batman in our world began with denial. Governments dismissed him as a high-tier vigilante from abroad. Some North American black site experiment, deniable and disposable. UA faculty debated whether direct engagement would escalate or contain the threat. Endeavor, enthroned by ego, announced he would handle the matter personally, as though the matter were a fire hazard and not a philosophy. Students, however, are always more honest than the systems that teach them. They felt what adults refuse to articulate. This new arrival did not behave like a villain, nor like a hero. He behaved like consequence. That distinction was critical. It frightened them. Asterisk because, for all our world's color and light, for all. The stadiums and festivals and televised bravado, for all the power to melt steel or shift earth or ignite air, we had forgotten consequence. Heroes were praised, even when their collateral damage choked entire districts in dust. Villains were condemned even when their crimes were born from hunger and misery. Batman disrupted that balance. He investigated a kidnapping ring run by low-tier heroes moonlighting for extra cash. He dismantled a political blackmail syndicate in 3 nights and leaked their assets to the public network. He exposed a hero agency laundering quirk-boosting narcotics. He did it with no quirk, only discipline, only obsession, only hunger, and somewhere beneath the surface, beneath the broadcast debates and diplomatic statements, beneath students whispering in dorm corridors, beneath villains taking notes with predatory interest, a seed of myth germinated. He had no origin here, so we invented one for him. They claimed he was the bastard son of All for One, engineered and abandoned. Others swore he was All Might's shadow, trained in the era before the symbol. More imaginative conspiracists insisted Nezu had built him in secret, a weapon meant to correct the hero system once it became too decadent to justify. Nezu laughed once when asked. Just once. That was enough to birth another rumor. But the truth was quieter, colder, older. Batman was not created by quirks, nor sponsored by nations. He was created by tragedy, the kind that does not redeem, only motivates. A child in a silent alley, clutching the bodies of parents who would never stand again. A city too rotten to mourn, a vow spoken through teeth still growing. We did not know those details yet, but we sensed the shape of them. Trauma has its own gravity. It distorts the air the way heat distorts distance on desert asphalt. By the second week of his arrival, villains respected him. Heroes feared him. Civilians questioned everything, and UA, the supposed bastion of order and instruction, finally acknowledged him not as anomaly, but as incursion. A hiring panel was convened. Documents unsealed. Faculty briefed in closed rooms. A single directive was given: observe, classify, if possible, contain. But definitions are prison bars. Bateman was never designed to fit inside them. By the time the world attempted to define his origins, he had already begun reshaping ours. Asterisk by the third week, the city had normalized panic. Humans are adaptable. That is, our genius and our curse. Sirens became background noise. Rumors became breakfast conversation. The Void Tear incident was already a meme. Batman had become a ghost that everyone pretended to understand. Meanwhile, he built a life without permission. He did not rent an apartment, nor register a residency, nor acquire a hero license. He carved a territory instead, the old metro, tunnels beyond Musudafu Station, sealed after the liquefaction of the Quirk. Infrastructure Act. Engineers abandoned the project when tremors twisted the support beams like metal bones. Civilians forgot it existed. Crime did not. That's where he lived. Not comfortably, not hygienically, but efficiently. Every day, though day meant nothing underground, his routine was the same. Wake before alarms. Breathe until the heart. Settled. Dress in armor, cold as morgue steel. Inventory gear with the precision of a surgeon preparing for amputation. The sounds were intimate and violent ratcheting clamps. Microservos, adjusting tension, carbon filament cables sliding against. Ceramic plating. There was no music, no jokes, no softness. Only the sterile whisper of discipline. We later learned he rationed food to the point of self-neglect. Freeze-dried protein bars, electrolytic paste, and bitter caffeine concentrate strong enough to peel enamel. Hero Society treated nutrition as sponsorship snacks branded for students. Energy drinks advertised on esports streams, stadium vendors selling victory-shaped pastries. Batman treated nutrition as fuel for warfare. His water was filtered through a Jurid system built from scavenged QuirkTech tubes and a cracked villain-grade carbon purifier. It tasted like dust and iron filings. He slept rarely, if that. Verb even applied. Dreams were interruptions, not relief. Above ground, heroes practiced optimism. Below, he practiced survival. And yet, routine is not just personal, it becomes cultural. Batman infected the city with routine too, in terrible increments. Villains halted nocturnal operations after 0300 hours. Too risky. Too many had not returned. The black markets adjusted schedules. The brothels closed early. The organ trade moved to daylight with pathetic hope that visibility would protect them. Heroes adopted new patrol patterns, triangulating around districts where Batman had been sighted. It was comical, in a bleak, academic sense, predators and counter-predators circling each other in ritualistic circuits, like wolves and shepherd dogs tracing invisible borders. At UA, the students felt the shift most painfully. Their routine had always been theatrical. Alarms at dawn, training classes, quirk drills that smelled of burnt rubber and chalk dust, cafeteria lines, simulated battles, exams, sleep. Repeat. Batman disrupted their choreography. Suddenly drills included Irvin, stealth countermeasures. Aizawa added night-stalking exercises, forcing students through abandoned alleys filled with mock crime scenes. Lights flickered. Mannequins with slashed throats spooked even the hardened ones. The hunger changed to not the hunger for food, but the deeper hunger for meaning. Midoriya obsessed silently, filling notebooks with frantic sketches, grapples, gauntlets, movement analysis, hypothesis. Bakugo snarled louder than usual, fury sharpened by fear he refused to name. Todoroki watched everything with frostbitten detachment, as though tracking weather patterns in human form. We woke collectively earlier. We trained harder. We sweat more. We dreamed less. The civilians developed rituals as well. doors locked. Before dusk, windows taped. News watched with reverence usually reserved for funerals. Children whispered about Bateman as though he were a ghost story that had forgotten its moral lesson. But routine has a cost. Routine breeds fatigue. Fatigue breeds mistakes. And mistakes feed predators. Batman hunted mistakes with religious zeal. A low-tier hero forgot to report a hostage situation. Bateman found him. The next morning, the hero was discovered dangling from a traffic light alive, screaming, wrists zip-tied, confession nailed to his chest. Civilians misread it as cruelty. Heroes recognized it as indictment. A trafficking ring skipped its scheduled drop. Batman traced the deviation through crushed vendor trash, tire imprints, and a single smear of cheap lipstick. It took him 6 hours to dismantle the entire network. They survived, but none could hold a pen after. The city's mornings became red-eyed and jittery. We brewed stronger coffee. We checked the streets for evidence of overnight justice, blood puddles, broken glass, chalk outlines with no corpses. The pavements became scripture etched in bruises and bandages. Routine became ritual. Ritual became doctrine. Doctrine became fear. And yet, beneath all this efficient suffering, something quiet grew, a question none dared say aloud. Because questions invite answers, and answers invite consequence. Were our heroes truly heroes? Or just performers in brightly colored skin? Batman did not ask. He demonstrated. Asterisk control here was never subtle. It wore capes. It smiled for cameras. It shook hands with presidents and prime ministers. It packaged safety into digestible segments, rankings, internships, merch, televised rescue operations, stadium tournaments where children bled for applause. We had mistaken this for progress. We had mistaken spectacle for justice. We had mistaken regulation for morality. Batman did not. He mapped the machinery of power within a week, diagramming it across walls of damp tunnel, concrete, chalk, grease, torn newspapers, surveillance schematics. No conspiracy theory, no occult paranoia. Just structure, markets, incentives, failures. He traced the hierarchy from UA to the Commission, from the Commission to the hero agencies, from agencies to sponsors, from sponsors to media, from media to culture. A perfect circle, a cage disguised as a carnival. Heroes did not maintain peace. They maintained narrative. Villains did not threaten order. They threatened ratings. And civilians. Civilians were the audience, profitable only in their fear. In Gotham, propaganda came in shadows and whispers. Here, it came in color and volume. Billboards flickered with heroic iconography, smiling faces beside burning buildings, fists raised against nameless villains. Children memorized catchphrases the way soldiers memorize rifle stances. Teachers instructed that becoming a hero was noble, but rarely explained noble for whom. The machines of power were not secret. They were celebrated every week. The Commission conducted assessments, smiling bureaucrats reducing moral philosophy into spreadsheets. Villains captured equaled points on leaderboards. Collateral damage subtracted merit. Public approval multiplied it. It was grotesque mathematics. Clean, bloodless, efficient. Executions did not happen on gallows. They happened in silence. Hero licenses revoked. Agencies defunded. Reputations suffocated under scandal. A hero could be erased legally, socially, financially without a single bullet fired. And the punishments for civilians Debts, evictions, silence. Bateman cataloged each mechanism, each ritual, each oath that pretended to protect society while serving the commission instead. He found the stimulant regimens too, the legal quirk enhancers prescribed to hyper students and pro-heroes, pills to sharpen reflexes, injections to boost adrenaline thresholds, patches to reduce REM sleep so heroes could patrol longer, side effects buried under pharmaceutical jargon. Hair loss, tremors, night terrors, addiction. Commission officials framed it as optimization. Heroes framed it as duty. Students framed it as necessity. Civilians framed it as progress. Batman framed it as slavery. He infiltrated a logistics hub. One night hero uniforms, pressed, sorted, tagged for distribution. Cleanliness as uniformity. Efficiency as control. Every stitch bore a sponsor's logo. Every reinforced seam testified to quirk specialization. The warehouse smelled of detergent and commerce. In one corner, disposal bins, uniforms stripped of branding, agency, patches removed. The garments of heroes who had failed, disgraced, disappeared. No funerals, no honors, just textile waste. There was irony so sharp it could have severed arteries. In Gotham, crime wore thrift store rags and heroes. War armor patched with hobbyist solder. The city broke in increments, as all cities do. No apocalypse arrives politely. It gnaws first, then bites, then swallows. And we were too addicted to routine, to spectacle, to stability painted in bright colors, to see the jaws closing. The first horror was mundane. A blackout. It struck Musudafu during peak traffic crosswalks, screaming red, course freezing mid-frame, drones dropping like dying insects. The entire district drowned in darkness thick enough to taste. Civilians screamed because they were not used to darkness. They had grown accustomed to heroes illuminating everything. Within minutes, the city reeked of burned circuits and cold sweat. The smell of fear was oddly academic, sterile, metallic, antiseptic. Like hospital corridors before surgery. Villains reacted first. Predators always do. Masked men and women slithered from alleyways, quirks igniting like curses. They smashed storefronts, dragged people from cars, overturned vending machines as if rebellion could be reduced to theft. It was pathetic, but pathetic horrors are still horrors. Batman moved through the blackout like a surgeon through an open rib cage, calm, purposeful, remorseless. Civilians who saw him claimed he split the darkness itself, as if the shadows potted for their architect. He broke bones and confiscated weapons. He subdued villains with the cruelty of someone who expected better from monsters. He did not rescue civilians, he redirected them. The difference mattered. Rescue breeds dependency. Redirection breeds survival. But that was only the first horror. Static clawed through the blackout, teeth grinding, skull buzzing, insectile. Vox distortions screeched through UAS emergency broadcast lines, as though someone were dragging metal on glass from inside the signal. Then came the second horror. Nightmares escaped the screens. Not literal monsters, not demons, not wart beasts, not yet, but hallucinations. Civilians collapsed, convulsing. Their eyes fluttered beneath lids, like moths trapped under cloth. They whispered things no linguist recognized, fragments of languages that sounded ancient and wet, like the ocean dreaming of violence. Doctors blamed hypoxia. Heroes blamed villain tech. The Commission blamed panic. Batman blamed no one. He listened. The blackout lasted 49 minutes. When the lights crawled back to life, blood smeared over storefront glass. Children sobbed in stairwells. 2 heroes were found unconscious with froth on their lips. And villains staggered away half-blind with dislocated joints. No coordinated purr. Assault, no objective, just chaos. And chaos is never pointless. It is diagnostic. Days later, the second horror returned in new form. Dreams. Students at UA woke screaming. Dorm halls reeked of sweat and fear. Midoriya vomited until he bled. From the throat? Bakugo struck his own reflection in the bathroom sink mirror as though killing something only he could see. Uraka whispered apologies in her sleep. Apologies to corpses, whose names she had never learned. Dreams should have ended at waking. They didn't. Echoes followed them through daylight. Aizawa reported distortions in perception, depth shifting, shadows lengthening against logical geometry. Nezu recorded the data with academic curiosity and the faintest hint of amusement. Endeavor blamed weakness. All Might blamed fate. Batman blamed signal interference, but not from machines, from minds. Meanwhile, the third horror bled into infrastructure. Villains began disappearing, not arrested, not defeated, not extracted, disappearing. Their hideouts were found stripped, masks folded, weapons catalogued, chains unwound, restraints removed. No bodies, no footprints, no heat signatures. The silence of absence spread faster than violence. The underworld thrives on gossip, but gossip needs corpses for punctuation. This had none. The fourth horror arrived with sound. A quake rattled the industrial district, violent but localized. Metal screamed against metal, factory beams bending like ribs under crushing weight. Rust flakes filled the air, stinging eyes, tasting like old blood. No earthquake registered on sensors, no tectonic anomaly, no villain declaration, nothing but sound and aftermath. Batman stood on a rooftop overlooking the smoke, lenses narrowing. He tilted his head, not in confusion, but recognition, as if some memory, ancient and filthy, had just surfaced from the gutters of his mind. And then the horror escalated properly. The sky split again, but not with cosmic corridors or void tears. It split with fire, plumes of it, controlled, directed, purposeful. Endeavor descended like a meteor, quirk blazing white with fury disguised as duty. Civilians cheered. A hero had arrived to restore order. The irony thickened the air. Batman watched him land. Fire against shadow, brutality against discipline, ego against consequence. Endeavor spoke first, voice amplified. Rehearsed for audiences. You're interfering with hero jurisdiction. Stand down. Batman said nothing. Silence curdled into tension. Civilians held their breath like worshippers waiting for divine conflict. Endeavor's flames brightened. The concrete beneath him crackled, smelling of charred minerals and cheap insulation. His rage needed an outlet. His quirk needed narrative. His legacy needed witnesses. Batman ruined that performance with a single sentence. Fire doesn't scare the dark. It feeds it. For a moment, Endeavor's flames hesitated, as if insulted. Then he lunged. The clash that followed was not the horror. The horror was how brief it was. Batman moved like industry, mechanical precision, ruthless efficiency, zero wasted motion. He did not overpower Endeavor. He redirected him. Flame turned inward. Heat suffocated its own oxygen. Endeavor crashed through a billboard plastered with his own face. Silence followed. Not triumph, not awe. Silence, like a grave, still waiting for a name. Endeavor rose, humiliated but breathing. Heroes rushed to intervention protocols. Civilians screamed for order. Cameras captured every angle. Sponsors prepared statements. The commission drafted explanations. But the real horror was not the fight. It was the realization that Batman had not come to defeat heroes. He had come to dismantle the story they were built on. And dismantling stories is more dangerous than dismantling institutions. Because institutions can rebuild. But belief, once shattered, only rots. Weapons reveal truths that words refuse. A gun tells you a society does not trust itself. A sword tells you it once believed in honor. Flamethrowers suggest fear of crowds. Sedatives suggest fear of loneliness. Batman's arsenal told us everything we needed to know about him. He never trusted chaos to behave. His gear appeared first, as rumor civilians describing glimpses between panicked breaths. A hook biting into concrete, a blade that didn't cut flesh yet severed intent, a chemical pellet that smelled of burnt citrus in hospital floors. For a week, the underworld speculated as if trading ghost stories from prison bunks. Only when students began collecting fragments, metal brackets, cable fibers, carbon shards, did the city understand the fetishism in his craft. There were no quirks in his tools, no magic, no bioengineered mutations. Just design, just precision, just discipline sharpened into matter. The grapnel gun was the first weapon examined, recovered from a rooftop by Midoriya, who held it with reverent terror, as if touching sacrament. It was a marriage of industrial pragmatism and obsessive paranoia. Tensile cables spooled around a ceramic cylinder, microhydraulics for recoil dampening, polymer grip molded to a hand shaped by violence. Not a single gram wasted. The bat were next. Students compared them to knives until they noticed the angle of the blades, not for killing, but controlling. The edges sliced cloth, muscle, tendon, dignity, but always avoided major arteries. Villains called them humiliation weapons. Heroes called them restraint tools. Batman called them standard equipment. But the tool that disturbed everyone was the smoke, not because of its appearance, but because of its aftermath. Heat pellets hissed when broken, then bloomed into choking fog that tasted like battery acid and citrus peel. Visibility zero. Breathing labored, heart rate spiking. Not lethal, just terrifying. Villains who tasted that smoke reported hallucinations, geometric shapes crawling along the walls, voices whispering statistical analysis of failure, colors saturating to painful brightness. Some vomited, others wept. One laughed, until he passed out. Heroes dismissed the hallucinations as exaggeration, until Aizawa conducted a controlled test in the training wing. His report was clinical and precise. The smoke induces panic without compromising motor function. It manufactures fear without profit. Efficient. Then came the armor. Batman's suit was not ornate like our hero costumes, nor sentimental like All Might's grotesque grin, nor theatrical like Hawk's feathers. It was black the way caves are black, not absence of color, but presence of depth. Ceramic plating over ballistic weave, shock gel hidden beneath carbon fiber ribs. Trauma pads arranged like segmented vertebrae. Every plate had a purpose, every seam a tactic. The cowl was worse not because of appearance, but because of meaning. It was a helmet pretending to be an animal, a predator carved into polymer. The ears were not decorative. They housed antennas for encrypted comms and thermal scanning. The lenses flickered through spectrum civili didn't have names for. It was a mask, yes, but also a question. What terrified criminals enough that he needed to become it? Symbols matter more than weapons. Symbols kill slower, but they never stop killing. Our world misunderstood symbols. Heroes wore smiles as branding, capes as marketing, slogans as gospel. Their symbols reassured. They soothed. They entertained. Their violence was televised, scheduled, monetized. Panic rarely arrives in screams. It begins in whispers, small, granular truths that scrape like grit beneath the skin of institutions. By the time anyone notices the screaming, the infection has already reached the bone. And so it was with the heroes.Batman did not topple agencies or expose scandals. He merely created an alternative, a parallel method, a rival morality. The hero system could tolerate villains. Villains validated its existence. But it could not tolerate competitors. That was when panic began. The commission closed-door emergency session. A polished table reflected anxious faces. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like malfunctioning bees. Charts showed rising distrust metrics. Spontaneous civilian debates. Independent neighborhood patrols growing in major urban zones. Not villain cells. Vigilantism cells. A commissioner tapped his pen until the tip broke. Commissioner, hero legitimacy depends on narrative control. He's dismantling narrative. Analyst, we recommend coordinated disinformation. Frame him as quirk-enhanced. Tie him to foreign groups. Imply addiction or mental instability. Another member spoke without looking up. Director, and if that fails? Silence. Director quietly. You cannot assassinate an idea. So assassinate the man. The decision smelled of resignation, not fury. Fury is honest. Resignation is strategic. Villain community warping of EXPCTATAON villains did not panic first. They adapted. Black markets began circulating grainy footage of Batman fights, slow motion, breakdowns of technique, gear, psychology, not idolization, procurement, reverse-engineering.SHIGARAK. I watched with a hand shaking, violently, not from fear, but recognition. Batman fought like a force older than quirks, deliberate, strategic, unsentimental. Quirks were chaos. Batman was order. Opposition attracts equilibrium. Shigaraki rasped under his breath. Shigaraki, he's not a hero. He's not a villain. He's curated inevitability. Dobby exhaled smoke. DABI. Systems panic when inevitability shows up. UA internal fracture sue. AI had been built as fortress and cathedral both, a school that sanctified justice. Now it felt more like a pressure vessel. Students began splitting into categories. Those who studied Batman with admiration. Those who studied him with fear. Those who studied him to surpass him. And those who pretended he was irrelevant as their hands trembled. Training drills shifted. Focus was no longer raw power, but information warfare, restraint, interrogation. Science, observation, improvisation. Midoriya devoured it, feverish, obsessive. Bakugo perfected it, predatory, precise. Todoroki resisted it. To him, tactics felt too close to destiny. Destiny felt too close to cruelty. Heroes are uncomfortable. when winning requires intelligence instead of spectacle. Spectacle was simpler. Spectacle was beautiful. Batman was neither. Psychological eroticos never need smoke or demons or mutation. It needs only contradiction. Contradiction breeds dissonance. Dissonance breeds distortion. And distortion is the true warp. Civilians whispered. If one man can do this without a quirk, then why do we need quirk heroes at all? Children whispered. What if being strong isn't enough? Heroes whispered. What if we've been performing instead of protecting? Even villains whispered. What if we misidentified the enemy? This was the panic of gods, the moment. Mortals noticed that divinity is a budget line item, not destiny. All Might's shadows in the mirror, All Might stared at his gaunt reflection. There were no demons in the room, no cosmic beasts, no eldritch influence, only the slow corrosion of faith. He remembered the devotion in children's eyes, pure, unquestioned, exponential. That devotion had been weaponized into stability, but devotion always decays into comparison. Even gods are not immune to being measured. He whispered, voice cracked like old steel. All Might, if he had existed in my era, would I have been enough? The mirror did not answer. Mirrors are executioners, not counselors. The unseen Sikura rooped, PTO, and panic birthed mutation, not physical at first, but conceptual. Siru stopped thinking as saviors. They began thinking as instruments. Villains stopped thinking as rebels. They began thinking as critics. Civilians stopped thinking as spectators. They began thinking as shareholders. The entire society shifted alignment, small degrees at first, imperceptible without measurement. But all catastrophe begins in decimals. Even Batman felt it. The tremor beneath strategy, chaos, spreads fastest in systems that believe they are immune. Closing image, the Asaijian atop, a rooftop in Musudafu. A beam of light carved through the Asudafu. A beam of light carved through the Asudafu. How do we know how to act as good bait? I'll be back soon. Spreads fastest, soon. Spreads fastest in systems that believe they are immune. Closing image, they are immune. Closing image, the Asudafu. Night sky, not a bad symbol, not branding, merely illumination. Heroes saw it as challenge. Villains saw it as invitation. Civilians saw it as possibility. Possibility is corruption's most loyal accomplice. The panic had only started, but inevitability was already inbound. Asterisk, there was a young vigilante, a second-tier hero with dreams brighter than his body could sustain. He called himself Iron Talon. Small, reckless, optimistic, he ran patrols alone, trying to earn merit and recognition. One night, he intercepted a villain attempting arson in a residential district. He fought valiantly, using everything he had. But the second he overextended, Batman appeared. No announcement, no warning, just presence. Batman subdued the villain in a manner precise enough to preserve the life of the trapped families, but brutal enough to leave Iron Talon trembling on the sidewalk. Batman. Every action has consequence. Every hero has responsibility. You are not ready? Iron Talon tried to argue, to explain, to plead. Batman did not respond, only the echo of footsteps receding through the alleys. By morning, Iron Talon's hero license was revoked, not for failure, but for hubris. His name, once bright, was stripped from record books. He became a ghost, whispering his own legend to an indifferent city. Story 2. The traitor who saved Noelani Toga, the girl who drank lives and stitched identities, had survived Batman's early judgment. She learned quickly that survival required more than bloodlusty. She infiltrated a minor hero agency, offering intelligence for money. She betrayed dozens, selling locations, quirk data, schedules, yet Batman never struck her. He observed, he cataloged, he waited. Months later, she attempted to escape with evidence that could collapse the agency. Batman intercepted her mid-flight. Batman, you trade trust for survival, yet fail to understand currency. You are bankrupt. The building collapsed under the weight of its own hubris. Toga survived, but her alliances evaporated. She wandered the city, a traitor to heroes, villains, and herself. No one trusted her. She had saved no one, not even herself. Legends grew around her. The girl who betrayed and was betrayed. The one who survived only to learn that survival alone is meaningless. Story 3. The madman who made sense a minor villain named Rust, obsessed with machines and urban decay, found Batman's methods compelling. He began leaving booby traps around the city, not to kill, but to test the limits of heroes, civilians, and his own morality. Batman hunted him, yes, but not to kill, to teach. Each encounter left Rust alive, but marked, shattered bones, broken machinery, psychological scars, meticulously cataloged lessons. By the third encounter, Rust whispered, "Rust, I was chaos incarnate, yet he made me understand patterns." Batman did not answer. He never explained. He never congratulated. He left Rust to ponder, half mad, half wise, a new legend wandering the streets, cautionary and mythic both. The aftermath of minor Legion de Siege legend was small, almost imperceptible except for how they rippled through the world. Students at UA whispered them, weaving them into theory, strategy, caution. Villains incorporated them into ritual, thinking myths could be used like weapons. Civilians passed them as bedtime stories, chilling but instructive. Batman did not need to speak. The city narrated his legend for him. Closing image: the night. Stadendia set up, the tallest skyscraper in Musudafu. Batman crouched. The wind tore at his cape. The city smelled of asphalt and faintly of copper. A lingering memory of blood. Below, a villain trembled in an abandoned alley. A hero reconsidered a reckless move. A child whispered a question she did not yet understand. The lesson was the same for all. Consequence is eternal. Justice is mutable. Fear is precise. And the city, already reshaped, whispered his name. Though, Dark Hero. The night exhaled. No victory, no defeat, only the slow, grinding continuation of legend. But that was only the prelude to despair. The city no longer slept. Not truly. Not since the shadows learned to move of their own accord. Windows reflected fear instead of light. Streets remembered the last scream. Even the sun seemed reluctant to rise, burning pale and hesitant against the metal bones of Musudafu. Batman had done what no hero, villain, or agency could. He had forced the world to confront itself. And what the world saw was not admirable. It was fragile. It was cruel. It was unworthy. Reflection: the human condi. Humans are predictable. We hope. We betray. We fight for principle, then sell it when convenience outweighs conscience. We idolize the strong, only to fear them the moment they stop performing. The heroes of our world were no exception. Endeavor, all might symbols of Strength, morality, discipline all trembling beneath the quiet inevitability of a man without quirk, without need, without compromise. Even villains revealed the same truth. Chaos is never pure. It is measured, rational, and selfish. Survival is the only law, and Batman existed outside all of it. Not for morality, not for glory, not for redemption, but for consequence, a lesson harsher than death, colder than blood. The poetic despair he watched the city from above, the rooftops jagged like teeth, the alleys like veins filled. On the highest rooftop, wind shredding the night, he paused. He could have stopped. He could have destroyed more. He could have saved some, but saving was never the point. The city stretched below him, alive with fear, ambition, and faint glimmers of hope it no longer deserved. Batman whispered to no one, "I do not save, I reveal. I do not punish, I expose." And in the end, the world is exactly as it always was. He disappeared into the darkness. The city did not recover. It only remembered, and legends, once remembered, never die. The streets would always smell of vine, the shadows would always move, the children would always whisper, and somewhere beneath it all, humanity learned a truth it could never unlearn. Consequence is eternal, hope is optional, and darkness is inevitable. Asterisk, the city never recovered. Not in the way anyone imagined. Not in the way hope promised. Skylines stood like fractured teeth, some blackened by fire, others twisted by quake-like tremors that left steel groaning in protest. Musudafu smelled of rust, ozone, and faintly of something older smoke that carried the memory of screaming and blood. Heroes had become myths. They walked the streets like ghosts, wearing costumes that once inspired, now only intimidated. Midoriya, older, thinner, eyes sunken from years of calculation and sleeplessness, studied crime reports as though the city itself were a lab rat in an experiment of human failure. He no longer dreamed of saving anyone. He cataloged consequences Bakugo. Moved like a predator who had learned caution at last. His fire burned, but it no longer dazzled. It illuminated nothing but his own exhaustion in the fragile, brittle forms of civilization beneath him. Todoroki had retreated into silence, speaking only to measure temperature gradients of the city's decay, as if the buildings themselves were emissaries of despair. Villains had fractured too. Some vanished entirely, others merged into underground networks of survival and barter. Even Shigaraki, older and more hollow, had learned that chaos without consequence is meaningless. The world had been corrected too sharply, and there was no place left for theatrics. Only survival. Civilians whispered the name that had become legend. The Dark Hero. He was no longer human. Not a man, not a symbol. He had become a law of physics, presence and absence simultaneously. Where he appeared, mistakes were corrected. Where he did not, systems decayed under their own weight. Children feared him. Adults revered him silently. No prayer could summon him. No screams could repel him. The media tried to call him vigilante, hero, monster, savior. Each word rang hollow. Words are cheap in a world where consequence is absolute. And yet, came the quietest hours between sirens and the hum of dying neon. He watched, always, from rooftops, from abandoned subway tunnels, from the shadows between buildings. He never intervened for glory. He never intervened for mercy. He intervened to remind the world that every action, every decision, Every lapse in judgment was permanent. Somewhere, a child cried in the darkness, naming a monster she did not understand. Somewhere, a villain shivered in a corridor, realizing they had survived only to witness the futility of their own schemes. Somewhere, a hero prepared for battle, knowing that victory was irrelevant and endurance was all that remained. And Batman, perched above it all, thought nothing. He felt nothing. He was the echo of consequence made flesh. The city smelled of iron, ozone, and ash. The wind carried the ghosts of decisions made poorly, of ideals abandoned, of faith corrupted, and somewhere in that mixture of air and memory, the world remembered the truth it could never unlearn. Darkness is not a visitor. It is the natural state, and those who think themselves gods are merely its students. The shadows stretched long across rooftops. The streets below pulsed with fragile life, unaware that every step was measured, every breath accounted for. And somewhere, in that vast, unfeeling city, the dark hero disappeared. Not a man, not a symbol, only a reminder. Asterisk, no one remembered how. Long it had been since the world had sunlight that didn't taste of iron. Even when the sun rose, it did so reluctantly, pale and filtered through smoke and dust that clung to skyscrapers like tumors. Musutafu had become a city of shadows stretched thin, an organism breathing in fear, exhaling despair. The heroes moved as echoes, performing their roles with mechanical precision. Midoriya cataloged every anomaly, every flaw, every failed intervention. Bakugo patrolled streets like a predator, but even he had learned that raw strength no longer commanded respect, only compliance. Todoroki's silence weighed heavier than all their explosions combined. His city's children whispered questions that nobody could answer. What is good? What is right? Who will save us when the saviors have vanished? And Batman was everywhere and nowhere. Not a man, not a myth, not a god. Only a four-sal lesson carved into reality. The collapse of Muar-al-Aita Waitha Commission had long since abandoned hope of control. They moved papers, drafted edicts, and broadcast statements claiming stability, but their words no longer carried weight. Villains exploited gaps that no hero dared fill. Minor criminal factions evolved into survivalist cults, worshipping the inevitability of consequence rather than the performance of power. Even ordinary citizens adapted. Where once they trusted symbols, now they measured actions. Where once they hoped, now they feared the absence of guidance. Civilians became reluctant strategists in a game they could not win. Batman watched it all, quietly. Every act of courage became a lesson in futility. Every act of cruelty became a lesson in inevitability. The legends, Farsi Tuari Toga, wandered the ruins, a ghost of identity, seeking meaning in blood she no longer drank. Rust lingered in collapsed factories, inventing puzzles to torment heroes and civilians alike, enjoying the philosophical cruelty of confusion. Iron Talon had vanished entirely, leaving only whispered warnings in alleyways about pride and overreach. Even the minor villains had become sulfur, trembling under a predator that could not be understood, only measured. No alliances persisted. No plans survived the scrutiny of the Dark Hero's logic. The Dark Hero's JUDGM bent, perched atop the tallest spire of Musutafu, black cape trailing like the residue of night. The wind carried the stench of decay and exhaust, of smoke, iron, and ash. His eyes, hidden behind lenses that reflected nothing and everything, observed the city as though it were an organism, He did not intervene. Not yet, he had already taught. The world that survival and morality are distinct. That consequence is indifferent. That hope is a luxury the untested cannot afford. He whispered into the void, though no ears were necessary. Humanity is a system of errors. Each choice compounds. Each failure endures. And still, they call themselves gods. The final twist, the city was quiet for only a moment, too brief for anyone to notice. Then the first tremor came, subtle at first, beneath the foundations of Musutofu. Buildings shivered, lights flickered, subways groaned. The dark hero did not move. He observed, because this was no natural disaster. It was the culmination of human fragility, society so fragile that the tiniest deviation of morality, of courage, of selfishness, could fracture everything. Even heroes were powerless. Even villains were powerless. Even civilians, the supposed innocents, were powerless. Only consequence remained. The shadows deepened. The city trembled. And the legend immutable, indifferent, eternal watched. Asterisk, the world had gone quiet in the way that only collapse can make quiet. Not silence, exactly, but the sound of a system too exhausted to scream. Even the wind seemed cautious, skimming across cracked asphalt and shattered glass as though afraid to disturb the ruins. The city, once a theater of heroes and villains, had become a laboratory. Each street, each alley, each rooftop an experiment in endurance, obedience, and despair. Batman observed, as he always did, perched like a shadow that had grown too large for the sun to touch. The civilization of FRAC2's buildings leaned as if whispering secrets to one another. Bridges sagged beneath weight and rust. Fires smoldered in places no one had noticed, the smell of ash curling through abandoned apartments. Children hid in corners, learning instinctively that heroism was performance and survival was calculation. Midoriya's notebooks lay open across the floor of UA, pages covered in frantic diagrams mapping human behavior, villain patterns, probability of mortality under various contingencies. His hands shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion, the unrelenting weight of knowing the truth. That the world was beyond saving. Bakugo patrolled aimlessly, burning what remained of the city in practice. Drills, though there was no threat left to extinguish. Strength had become meaningless, power hollow, hope a lie. Todoroki traced thermal currents through collapsed walls, searching for heat that might signify life, but even life was no longer a guarantee. The city was learning what Batman had always known. Humans are fragile, and the systems they build are more fragile still. Legends in Decia Waidoga roamed the empty streets. A half-remembered legend of a girl who drank lives, now drinking nothing but memory and shame. Rust dismantled machines in factories long abandoned, leaving traps not for heroes or villains, but for the next generation that might stumble unknowingly into his lessons. Even the remaining villains were quiet. Shadows of shadows, too wary to act, too aware to hope. The city had become a myth made real, every mistake magnified, every choice permanent, every action accountable. Batman crouched above it all. He did not intervene, not because he was merciful, not because he cared, because intervention had no meaning. The lesson was complete. Humanity, heroes, villains, and civilians alike had been exposed to the pure metric of consequence. He whispered to the night, a voice carrying only to those who listened closely. I am not your savior. I am not your punishment. I am the mirror of every choice you have ever made. Look long enough, and you will understand. The echo of his words seemed to settle over the city like a weight. The ultimate truth: no one could save themselves. No one could save others. Civilization, morality, heroism, they were fragile constructions, illusions against entropy. Even the strongest, the cleverest, the most virtuous, were subject to the same relentless calculus. The shadows were not his allies. The darkness was not his enemy. It was the only truth that remained. The wind shifted, rooftops groaned, and the dark hero, perched above a world that would never recover, vanished into silence. Not for vengeance, not for glory, not for justice, only observation. And the city remembered. The city no longer recognized itself. Streets twisted like the memory of maps. Buildings leaned as though apologizing to gravity, and the air hummed faintly with ozone and metal decay. Musodafu was alive, in the way a wound is alive, conscious only of its own fragility, its inability to heal. Bateman watched it all, no longer from rooftops or shadows, but from every angle simultaneously, as if presence and absence had merged. He was no longer a man. He had become observation incarnate, mirror reflecting every fear, every failure, every choice of the fragile species below. The world without Akaro as heroes persisted in name only. Their powers still existed, but the purpose had vanished. Training drills became empty rituals, rescue missions, exercises in futility. The media called it stability. The people called it endurance. But endurance without guidance is merely waiting for collapse. Villains adapted or tried to, but the predator in the shadows taught lessons faster than any ideology could spread. Every calculated rebellion, every chaotic outbreak, every quirk unleashed was cataloged, measured, corrected. Fear was no longer random. It had become precise. Civilians whispered the stories of the dark hero, not tales of victory or justice, but of inevitability. He was not a god, not a hero, not a villain. He was a constant, a law, a reckoning. Legends turned to Wimwitastoga, drifted through the ruins, a hollow echo of her former self. Russ dismantled the city's machinery not to kill, but to demonstrate entropy. Iron Talon had vanished, leaving only warnings scrawled on walls. Pride consumes the unprepared. Midoriya Bakugo, Todoroki. They persisted, not as saviors, but as recorders, observers, analysts, survivors, forced to understand that no act of courage could erase consequence. Even the commission had become irrelevant. Bureaucracy had collapsed under the weight of its own inefficiency. Public trust decayed, like rust on iron beams. The city had become a classroom, and the students were terrified. The mirror SPAK's Bateman perched atop the highest spire. Wind shredded the air around him, carrying ash, iron, and faint memory of blood. He did not speak to the people below. They were already listening. He whispered to the city itself. Every choice, every hesitation, every failure, all recorded, all remembered, all permanent. No one protested, no one cheered, no one prayed. Only the city answered in the subtle creak of metal, the hum of exhausted electricity, the faint sigh of rubble settling, and the truth was unmistakable. Humanity had been observed. Humanity had been measured. Humanity had been found wanting. The final IMAG, the sun, pale and reluctant, tried to pierce the clouded sky. Rooftops and alleyways stretched like veins of an organism too exhausted to live. Children whispered questions they would never understand. Villains trembled where shadows intersected. Heroes moved like ghosts across a land that no longer needed them. And Batman, the eternal mirror, dissolved into the darkness he had always inhabited, leaving the city to confront itself alone. Not saved, not destroyed, not judged, only reflected, and in that reflection, the world saw its own fragility. Forever. Time had become a mockery. Days blended into nights, nights into longer nights. The city no longer registered calendars. It only registered survival. Musudafu had transformed into a living ledger of human failure, walls scarred with warnings, streets etched with footprints that repeated endlessly like the looping record of consequence. Batman did not move. He had no need to. Presence was irrelevant. Observation was enough. Every heartbeat, every twitch, every small act of rebellion or desperation below was noted, catalogued, and understood. The void listened. And in the void, the world had become an open book. Humanity and the Xelania children had stopped dreaming of heroes. They whispered names that had once inspired fear, now only carried inevitability. The Dark Hero. Adults moved mechanically. Those who once performed heroism for status now performed morality as a transaction, calculating cost versus risk, watching each other as much as the streets themselves. Villains were fewer, but sharper. Survivalist cults emerged, factions that understood one truth above all. Death is predictable, consequence is absolute, and even the cleverest escape is temporary. Even heroes had adapted to fear, not to fight. Midoriya, once filled with hope, now calculated probabilities with trembling hands. Todoroki moved silently, surveying heat signatures, every gesture stripped of idealism. Bakugo's flames scorched little but the memory of rebellion itself. The teacher in SHADOWS Batman did not intervene, not out of mercy, not out of restraint, not out of code. Intervention would have been redundant. Humanity's flaws were self-reinforcing. His lessons were already ingrained. He whispered to no one, though the city could hear. I do not dictate. I do not punish. I do not save. I observe. And in observation, the world learns itself. Too late. Every choice below, every hesitation, every act of hubris became a permanent record. A scar etched into the city's memory. The spectacle of Seo and Sequency, the city shifted as though alive. Collapsing structures groaned in recognition of human failure. Fires smoldered, lights flickered, wind carried the smell of iron and old smoke. All that was left were the consequences. Civilians walked among ruins, unaware that survival itself had become a moral compromise. Villains trembled at the thought of movement, knowing the predator above had already accounted for them. Heroes calculated, waited, measured, but no act could undo what had been revealed. Even hope had been catalogued and dissected, leaving only the raw core: fear, understanding, inevitability. The mirror of the void Bateman's cape billowed like the final shadow of night. His eyes scanned the city through lenses that measured every angle, every micro-movement, every possible outcome. He was no longer man, no longer hero, no longer myth. He had become a lens, a mirror reflecting the ultimate truth of humanity. Fragility, impermanence, and inevitable failure. The world could scream, plead, fight, or pray. It would not matter. The Dark Hero had disappeared from view, but his presence was infinite. The void had learned, and the world had nothing left to teach. The world had grown quiet, not peaceful, but deliberate. Every step in the streets echoed. Like judgment, every light flickered as if aware of its own insignificance. Musudafu had become a cathedral of entropy. Steel groaned, glass cracked, concrete wept, dust. Life persisted, but only in fragments. Batman moved no longer. His figure no longer needed presence to enforce consequence. He had become the architecture of fear itself, the invisible scaffolding that held civilization in its precarious place. Observation had become his weapon, silence his doctrine. Heroes without light Midoriya no longer ran. He catalogued every quirk, every movement, every miscalculated instinct beneath him had been studied, recorded, and predicted. Hope was irrelevant. Only data mattered. Bakusa's fire burned less frequently. Now it was only practice, reminders of capability without application. The city had stopped offering spectacle. It offered survival only, and survival demanded calculation, not courage. Todoroki moved through the ruins. Flames and ice balanced against the entropy of the city itself. There was no heroism left, only endurance. Even All Might's legend had faded, absorbed into the lessons of consequence. Children no longer whispered his name. They whispered the dark heroes. Villains, as REF T. Owens adapted to fear, but they could not outrun it. Shigaraki, hollowed by repeated confrontation, now ruled a faction not of rebellion but of measured obedience. Every crime, every act of violence, every chaotic outbreak was a controlled experiment, chaos constrained by the inevitability of Batman's observation. Toga wandered as a relic of identity, her former chaos hollowed by the realization that no disguise could obscure consequence. Rust, half mad, half wise, left machines deconstructed as lessons. Each failure an artifact for the next generation of the city's inhabitants. Even the minor criminals calculated now. Fear had become the baseline of their existence. Survival required understanding that the predator above always knew. The OBCR-VR Batman crouched high above the city on a spire of twisted steel and cracked concrete. The wind shredded his cape, but he felt nothing. Observation was sufficient. He did not intervene. Intervention was redundant. Humanity had revealed itself. Every choice, every hesitation, every misjudgment the city had produced them all without guidance. He whispered into the void, and the wind carried his words like falling ash. You are fragile. The city breathed like a dying organism, slow and shallow. Asphalt cracked, buildings bent, and shattered glass caught the pallid sunlight like fractured eyes. Musudafu no longer knew seasons or time. Nights bled into days without distinction. The air carried the scent of iron ash and decay, as if the world itself had learned to mourn. Batman did not move. He did not intervene. Observation was sufficient. He had already taught the lessons that no one could unlearn. Humanity, heroes, villains each, had performed under the unflinching gaze of consequence. None had survived unmarked the collapse. Ofakopi children no longer cried for heroes. They whispered questions into the shadows, questions without answers. Who will save us? Who is good? Who can stop them? Heroes existed only in form. Midoriya catalogued, analyzed, calculated. Bakugo patrolled, not for justice, but to remind himself he could. Todoroki wandered, balancing flames and ice against entropy, a scientist of despair. All Might's name was a ghost. No one remembered inspiration. only consequence. Villains, too, had fractured. Shigaraki's faction existed merely to survive. Toga drifted through abandoned streets, identity hollowed by the realization that no quirk or disguise could evade judgment. Rust dismantled machinery as if entropy itself were a tutor, leaving riddles for those who would come next. Even the weak calculated. Even the helpless abbot bayed because failure had become too tangible to ignore. The dark heroes Lesesso and Batman crouched atop a spire of steel and rubble. His eyes, hidden behind lenses that reflected nothing and everything, observed. He spoke only to the void, though all the city felt the weight of his words. All illusions are temporary. All power is finite. Every choice echoes, and you have all failed to measure it. He did not descend. He did not intervene. Humanity had already written its own lesson into the ruins, and the city listened. The mirror of Sion Esequiu and Cio rooftops and alleys stretched endlessly beneath him. Fires smoldered in abandoned apartments, fountains of ash rising into the pale sky, streets twisted like veins, carrying whispers of those who had survived, of those who had failed. Every act, every hesitation, every misjudgment had been recorded. In the architecture itself, even the wind seemed to learn the language of despair, carrying the scent of iron and smoke like punctuation in a story too long and too dark to finish. Batman's shadow stretched across the city, not as a symbol, but as a law, inevitable, absolute, indifferent, final. Ima, the sun, weak and dying, struggled through haze and smoke. Shadows pooled in alleys and over streets. Humanity existed in fragments, struggling against entropy. Batman vanished into darkness, though his presence lingered in every corner, every whispered fear, every carefully measured action. The city had learned the truth it could not unlearn. There is no salvation. There is no victory, only observation. And the weight of consequence is eternal. Musudafu no longer had inhabitants in any meaningful sense. Streets were full of movement, but the people were shadows, performing rehearsed gestures, like actors in a theater that had long since burned. Concrete groaned under its own fatigue, glass glittered like broken teeth, and the smell of ash and rust clung to every surface. The city had become a mirror not of its people, but of their failure. Every choice, every hesitation, every act of cruelty or compassion was reflected back at them, amplified, impossible to ignore. And at the center of that mirror, silent and eternal, crouched the dark hero. Heroes in Vigilantiesmia no longer sought to save anyone. He tracked patterns, mapped probability, and cataloged mistakes with obsessive precision. Each failed intervention, each misjudged quirk, became data for the inevitable calculus of survival. Bakugu moved like a predator without prey, flames burning ritualistically over abandoned streets, a reminder of capability without purpose. Todoroki measured heat and cold in ruins, watching entropy dictate outcomes with impartial eyes. Even minor heroes had learned. Hope was optional, morality was arbitrary. Survival required calculation. Villains and survivors Shigaraki's faction had become a hollow shadow of rebellion. Every act of violence was constrained by the ever-present consequences of the dark hero's gaze. Toga wandered aimlessly, identity fractured, her chaos reduced to introspection and emptiness. Rust dismantled machines and abandoned factories, leaving lessons etched in metal and oil for a world that no longer needed them. Even the smallest criminal hesitated before movement. Every action carried weight because the city itself had learned to record consequences. Batman. The immutable OBCRVR Batman crouched atop the tallest spire, wind tearing his cape. His eyes reflected nothing and everything. He spoke only to the city, a voice without sound, a judgment without mercy. You are fragile. You are predictable. You are incapable of hope that survives scrutiny. And still, you persist, unaware that endurance alone is meaningless. He did not descend. Intervention was no longer necessary. Humanity had already enacted its own lesson. The mirror of the CIT wire rooftops twisted like skeletal fingers. Streets folded over themselves. Fires smoldered, casting faint light across cracked asphalt and rusted metal. The air was heavy with the smell of iron, smoke, and decayed, the only constants in a world where all else had been measured, observed, and catalogued. Even the wind seemed to know its place, whispering truths too heavy for anyone to bear. That survival is temporary, that morality is conditional, that consequence is eternal. Batman vanished into shadow, though his presence remained in every corner, every alley, every fear, every calculated hesitation. Final IMAG, the sun, dim and reluctant, tried to pierce the haze. Shadows pooled in the streets below. The city moved, but it no longer lived. Every step echoed lessons learned too late. Every voice whispered truths too heavy to hold. And somewhere above it all, the dark hero remained. Not a man, not a symbol, not a savior, only a mirror. Relentless, impartial, eternal. The city learned, finally, what it could never unlearn. There is no salvation. There is no justice. Only consequence. And the echoes last forever. Asterisk Musudafu no longer breathed in the way. A city should. Its lungs were the shattered streets. Its heartbeat the faint hum of failing machinery. Its arteries the twisted, empty subways that once carried life. The air hung thick with iron and smoke, a permanent reminder that survival carried cost and consequence beyond reckoning. Batman no longer moved. He did not need to. Presence was irrelevant. Observation was sufficient. Humanity had been tested, examined, and found fragile. Every choice, every hesitation, every act of defiance or desperation had been noted, measured, and catalogued. The city had become a record of failure. Heroes Fractory Dodoria walked through ruins like a ghost among ghosts. His notebooks overflowed with diagrams and probabilities, but no calculation could restore what had been lost. His quirk, once a symbol of hope, was now a tool of analysis, a means of recording consequences rather than changing them. Bakugu's flames burned less for effect and more for ritual. Each flare was a reminder of his power, useless against the weight of inevitability. Todoroki balanced heat and cold against entropy itself. The remnants of heroism now reduced to endurance and observation. All Might's legend had faded entirely, absorbed into the shadow of the dark hero. Children, no longer whispered his name. They whispered the inevitability of consequence itself. Villains and survival Shigaraki's faction moved with precision, but the precision was hollow. Chaos had been disciplined into obedience by the weight of observation. Toga drifted through. Empty streets, identity hollow, consuming memories like sustenance. Rust dismantled machines and abandoned factories, leaving riddles of entropy for a generation that may never arrive. Even minor criminals measured every act. Survival demanded calculation, and miscalculation meant erasure. Fear had become a law. more potent than any quirk or weapon. Batman the Impartial lay high above the city. Batman crouched atop a twisted spire. His cape whipped violently in the wind, but he did not feel it. His lenses reflected nothing and everything. He whispered, a soundless echo that carried across streets and alleys. Your choices define you. Your mistakes define you. You cannot hide. You cannot run. Every action will be recorded, every hesitation punished, even if the punishment is only understanding your own failure. He did not descend. Intervention had become redundant. Humanity had enacted its own lesson over and over, leaving only fragments to witness the weight of inevitability. The city, as alas, its buildings leaned like bones. Streets curled into themselves. Fires smoldered in abandoned apartments. Every alleyway whispered fellies. Every rooftop bore witness to hesitation. Every life was a lesson in futility. Every breath a reminder that consequence is eternal. Children learned fear without instruction. Heroes learned despair without defeat. Villains learned restraint without hope. The city itself had become a classroom, and Batman, the dark hero, was its eternal observer. Final Ima Geetha's sun struggled through the haze, weak and pale. Shadows pooled like ink over rooftops and alleys. The city moved, but it no longer lived. And above it all, the dark hero remained, a mirror of consequence. A law beyond morality, a presence that was eternal. The lesson had been taught. Humanity had been exposed, and the city finally understood what it could never unlearn. There is no salvation, there is no victory, only consequence, and collapse is eternal. Musudafu no longer existed as a city in the conventional sense. Its streets were veins of memory, its buildings carcasses of forgotten ambition, its air heavy with iron ash, and the faint temps of burned hope. Even time felt fractured, moving in splinters instead of ours. Every act, every hesitation, every heartbeat was catalogued in the invisible ledger of consequence. The dark hero had imposed. Batman no longer crouched or moved. His presence had become omnipresent and immutable. He was not man. He was not myth. He was a lens through which the world measured its own fragility, a mirror that reflected every failure, every miscalculation, every ephemeral flicker of hope, amplified it. Hiruzen, the Igemidoria, walked among rubble and shadows, quirk dormant, eyes wide, with obsessive calculation. Every misjudged action, every hesitation, every attempt at heroism replayed itself in his mind like an endless loop. He had become a historian of collapse rather than a savior, cataloging the decay of morality and the inevitability of consequence. Bakugu's flames burned intermittently, each flare a ritualistic punctuation of futility. Every act of aggression now served only to remind him of what power could not fix. Todoroki moved silently, flames and ice coiled in a tense balance, not to protect, but to measure, as if entropy itself were a living adversary. Even All Might's legacy had dissolved, entirely replaced by the suffocating gravity of inevitability. Children no longer whispered about heroes. They whispered about the dark hero, a presence that could not be challenged, escaped, or comprehended. The fracture of villain Shigaraki's faction had lost the thrill of rebellion. Chaos was no longer a tool, but a reminder of limits. Every violent act, every plot, every subversive move was tempered by the awareness that the dark hero observed, recorded, and catalogued everything. Toga drifted like a ghost, consuming memories not for sustenance, but to feel the illusion of identity. Rust dismantled machinery, leaving trails of entropy and logic puzzles for a city that no longer had anyone capable of solving them. Even petty criminals hesitated. Fear had become absolute law. Survival demanded calculation, and miscalculation meant permanent erasure. The dark heroes OBCRV serving high above the city. Batman's silhouette clung to the twisted spire like a shard of night. His cape flared violently in the wind, but he felt nothing. The city spoke through shadows, through echoes, through failures. He did not need to intervene. He whispered, a soundless voice that resonated in the bones of the city. You are fragile. You are predictable. You are finite. And all illusions of freedom, heroism, and morality are meaningless before inevitability. Learn or cease to exist in relevance. The city shuddered under the weight of his observation, as if acknowledging its failure without complaint, without revolt, without understanding this city as a mere alleyways folded over themselves. Fires smoldered in abandoned apartments, leaving the faint, acrid smell of ash and iron. The streets were veins of memory, the rooftops skeletal bones of ambition, the air a static of despair. Children learned fear instinctively. Heroes learned despair instinctively. Villains learned caution instinctively. The city had become a classroom, and Batman, the dark hero, was its immutable teacher. Final IMAG, the sun struggled through haze and ash, pale and weak. Shadows pooled over broken rooftops and twisted streets. Humanity existed only as reflection, as echo, as mistake, catalogued. And above it all, Batman remained, not as man, not as myth, not as savior, only observation, only consequence, only the eternal. Whisper of oblivion. Asterisk, the city had begun to rot from within. Not visibly at first. Musudafu's streets, buildings, and subways remained standing, but the people were unraveling. Fear had calcified into instinct. Despair had seeped into sinew and bone. The dark hero's observation was no longer passive. It pressed upon humanity like a weight they could never measure, a law they could never evade. Windows reflected hollow eyes. Doors creaked under the faintest pressure of imagined footsteps. The air smelled of iron, sweat, ash, and the faint tinge of chemical decay, a reminder that life itself was fragile. Heroes become monitors of their own failure. Ramadoria no longer acted. He catalogued every movement he had once made in the name of justice. Was now a lesson in futility. Quirk power was irrelevant. Probability and consequence mattered far more. He walked among the ruins like a ghost, surrounded by echoes of those he could not save. Bakugu's flames, once a symbol of rebellion, and courage, burned low, ritualistic, devoid of intent. Todoroki's control of fire and ice had become a meditation on entropy, flare and frost, a measure of what could no longer be changed. Even All Might's legacy had decayed, whispered only in hushed tones as a cautionary tale of hope that could not survive the scrutiny of consequence. Villains morphed into reflections of the site. Shigaraki's gang had abandoned chaos for measured, almost surgical survival. Every crime was calculated to avoid the invisible law that governed their every action. Togo wandered as a hollow shell, consuming memories for the illusion of identity. Rust dismantled factories and machinery, leaving riddles of entropy for a city that no longer had anyone to solve them. Minor criminals no longer committed petty theft. They rehearsed survival, aware that even small mistakes could ripple outward in irreversible consequence. Fear had become instinct. Despair, physiology. The dark hero observer of Batman perched atop the highest tower, shrouded in wind and shadow. His presence was everywhere, yet nowhere. He had become a force, a constant, an immutable law. He whispered into the void, a voice that resonated in the city's very bones. You have become predictable. Your flesh, your mind, your society, nothing escapes the consequences of your choices. Even survival carries the weight of failure. The city shuddered, but no one rose to challenge him. The lesson had been internalized too deeply. Humanity was now a series of reactions, each one more constrained than the last. The city as Sir Raga PTO and alleys twisted unnaturally. Fires smoldered in abandoned homes, carrying acrid smoke that burned lungs even without direct exposure. Windows reflected faces that were no longer human, eyes hollowed by fear and observation. Pavement fractured like bones under the weight of existence. Even the wind seemed aware, carrying the whisper of decay, tracing the curves of ruined buildings and the shoulders of broken people. Children no longer asked questions, they internalized fear. Heroes no longer acted, they internalized failure. Villains no longer schemed, they internalized inevitability. The city itself had become an organism of entropy, and Batman the Dark Hero was its unblinking eye. Final IMAG, the sun was a pale, flickering ember in a sky choked with ash. Shadows lengthened, merging, becoming indistinct pools across rooftops and streets. Humanity existed as fragments, physical, mental, moral fragments moving through a city that had become a reflection of itself, and above it all, Batman remained. Not a man, not a myth, not a savior. Only observation, only reflection, only the eternal imprint of consequence. Musudafu no longer obeyed natural law. Streets twisted into impossible angles, buildings leaned like tired bones, and subways sunk into themselves as though the ground beneath the city had learned despair. Even light faltered, refracted oddly through dust and smoke, revealing glimpses of streets that should not exist, corners that should not connect. The city had become a reflection of the people within it, fractured, twisted, hopeless. Humanity's fragility had begun to reshape reality itself, bending the environment to mirror consequence. Batman did not move. He did not intervene. Presence was sufficient. Observation was the law. Every step, every breath, every thought below was accounted for, catalogued, measured, and where necessary punished by reality itself. Heroes fractured against realitimadoria walked the warped streets, notebook in hand, quirk dormant, calculating every possible deviation in an environment that effused normalcy. Each misstep threatened collapse. Every hesitation became a lesson in futility. Bakugo moved like a ritualistic predator, flames licking at walls that bent unnaturally toward him, as if reality itself sought to test his endurance. Todoroki's flames and ice interacted with warped physics, bending and freezing at angles impossible, forcing him to adapt beyond instinct, beyond training. Even All Might's legacy, once a beacon, had dissolved entirely. Children whispered only of the Dark Hero, a figure who had forced the city itself to obey consequence. Villains corrupted by consequence Shigariki. The faction moved carefully through streets that no longer obeyed geometry. Chaos had become irrelevant. Survival now meant understanding that even the laws of matter could conspire against you. Toga drifted through warped alleyways, identity hollow, as reflections of herself multiplied unnaturally in broken glass. Rust dismantled factories, leaving riddles embedded in warped machinery. Each puzzle was now impossible, a lesson in entropy made manifest. Even petty criminals learned to fear the streets themselves. One wrong step could plunge a sidewalk into an endless chasm, or trap a hand in a twisting wall. Fear had become instinct. Reality had become teacher. Batman, the immutable lens sigh atop a leaning spire of steel and concrete, Batman observed. His lenses reflected impossible angles, warped perspectives, and streets that should not connect. He did not descend. He did not act. Humanity's corruption had become reality itself. Observation was law, and law required no action. He whispered. Into the void, a voice carried in the warp of the city's altered geometry. Musudafu was no longer a city, it was a wound. Its streets pulsed with a subtle, oppressive rhythm, like veins carrying not blood, but the weight of judgment. Buildings leaned, twisted, and groaned under their own impossibility. The air smelled of iron, ash, and human failure, a tangible miasma that seeped into lungs and nerves alike. Batman no longer needed to perch. He was everywhere, in every shadow, every distorted street, every trembling mind. His observation had become infectious. The weight of consequence had entered the people themselves, reshaping them from within. Heroes corrupted from within felt it first. Each calculation of probability became a chain around his mind. Quirked power flickered uncertainly, controlled more by fear than intent. Every decision carried echoes of failure that resonated in his body. A subtle tremor, a tightening of muscles, a whisper of doubt. Bakugu's flames sputtered and flared, unpredictably, reflecting the instability in his mind. Todoroki felt heat and cold twist unnaturally, as though reality itself were testing his balance. Even the most disciplined movements felt uncertain, corrupted by the pervasive influence of consequence made manifest. All Might's memory haunted the city, but only as a pale warning. Hope without understanding is meaningless. Villains infected by observation, Shigeru's faction, fell silent. Every act of violence carried immediate psychic weight, a whisper of failure pressing into their minds. Toga's identity fractured further, multiplied by mirrors, reflections, and twisted reality. Rust's machines, dismantled for entropy, now seemed almost alive, radiating lessons of futility and decay that pricked the subconscious. Even the smallest criminals moved with paranoia. Each step, a negotiation with invisible forces. The city had become a neural network of judgment, linking every action to consequence. Infection spreading through mind and muscle alike. Batman, the vector of INEVI, above the city. Batman's silhouette remained still atop a leaning spire. His lenses recorded every minute change, thought patterns, micro-expressions, heartbeats, and miscalculations. He did not intervene. He did not judge. Observation was enough. He whispered through the infected minds of humanity, a voice that bypassed ears and entered consciousness directly. Your mind obeys consequence as your body obeys gravity. Every hesitation twists you. Every misstep leaves scars you cannot heal. You are the instruments of your own corruption. The city trembled, not in buildings alone, but in the minds and bodies of those who lived or survived within it. The city's DCLs are now twisted into impossible spirals. Fires burned in impossible spaces. Shadows pooled like liquid, creeping up walls and enveloping those who moved below. The smell of iron, ash, and smoke was joined by a chemical temps of nervousness. of fear made physical. Children shivered at the edges of perception, understanding instinctively the rules of survival without instruction. Heroes moved in mechanical patterns, tracking cause and effect rather than intervening. Villains hesitated, paralyzed by the weight of inevitable consequence. Musudafu was no longer just a city, it was a disease of observation, a system that infected body, mind, and soul. Final IMAG, the sun, dim and fractured by smoke and warped clouds, illuminated streets that no longer obeyed geometry. Shadows pooled unnaturally. Humanity existed as fractured, corrupted fragments, minds and bodies warped by consequence, and Batman remained. Not man, not myth, not savior. Only observation, only infection, only the eternal disease of consequence. Musudafu had ceased to exist as a recognizable city. Streets twisted into impossible angles, buildings split and leaned like shattered bones, and subways collapsed into endless chasms. The sky was an ashen void, pierced by pale, reluctant sunlight that only accentuated the scars of what remained. The air was thick with iron ash, smoke, and a faint chemical tang of fear every breath, a reminder of inevitable failure. Batman no longer needed to perch, move, or speak. Observation was no longer a tool, it was a law. Every heartbeat, every hesitation, every step across the fractured streets was catalogued, analyzed, and punished by the immutable weight of consequence. Humanity itself had become an instrument of apocalypse. Heroes on Madame Midoriya staggered through streets that bent impossibly beneath him. Probability calculations looped endlessly in his mind, but no pattern could predict the city's chaos. His quirk flared involuntarily, more a reaction than a choice. Each failure internalized as physical and mental scarring. Bakugu's flames flickered across warped walls, hitting angles that defied physics. Each flare reflected not rebellion, but ritualistic endurance. Todoroki's fire and ice twisted unpredictably, reacting to a city that had become a reflection of humanity's mistakes. All Might's legacy was a whisper of a lesson. Heroism is irrelevant when consequence is absolute. Villains and Entropish Garaki's faction disintegrated under the weight of observation. Violence was no longer choice. It was calculation. Survival without joy or purpose. Toga wandered fractured streets, consumed by a multiplying reflection of herself in broken glass and warped shadows. Rust's machines hummed faintly, as if aware, leaving puzzles of futility that mocked the living. Minor criminals no longer acted. Each movement carried psychic weight. Each step could trigger ruin. Fear had become instinct. Despair had become physiology. The city was a crucible where entropy and consequence fused. Batman, the absolute OBCR Bateman, crouched atop a leaning spire of steel and concrete, wind and ash tearing his cape around him. His lenses recorded impossible angles, warped structures, and human behavior, all in perfect detail. He did not intervene. Judgment was unnecessary. Humanity had already collapsed under its own inadequacy. He whispered into the void, not words carried by air, but thoughts carried directly into the city's fractured consciousness. You have become your own undoing. Every hesitation, every misjudgment, every moral failure has led to this. You cannot escape consequence. You cannot survive it. Even endurance is meaningless here. The city as APOCLYPSEL has spiraled into themselves like broken DNA. Fires burned in impossible places. Shadows pooled unnaturally, moving as if alive. The smell of iron, ash, smoke, and chemical fear saturated every corner. Children, heroes, and villains alike had internalized the city's lesson. Reality obeys consequence. Survival itself had become a test of obedience to inevitability. Humanity was a reflection of its own failures, amplified to apocalyptic proportions. Musudafu was no longer a city. It was a manifestation of consequence made tangible a living. Apocalypse. Final IMAG. The sun, pale and fractured, struggled through clouds of ash and dust. Streets twisted impossibly, shadows pooled in impossible geometries. Humanity existed as fragments, minds, bodies, morality, all warped, all broken, all catalogued, and above it all, Batman remained. Not man, not myth, not savior, only observation, only apocalypse, only the eternal weight of consequence.